So the first question we have is from Akolile, who is based in Edinburgh. So he's a PhD candidate in New Testament at Edinburgh University. Akolile asks, where does this cultural Marxist labeling come from, and why is it used negatively towards those who advocate for the rights of the oppressed groups? Anyone care to take that one? Or I'll assign somebody to take that one. Stephen, do you care to take a stab?
I can try. I think the cultural Marxist part comes because of the historical connection between critical theories and groups like the Frankfurt School, which come out of cultural Marxism, wanting to take Marx's ideas about economics and broaden it more generally to other social features. So that's where it is. But I think the reason it's used in a negative way is because of bigger ideological culture wars really going on in the Western world between socialism and capitalism, Marxism, non-Marxism, and things like that. And so Marxist becomes a bit of a dirty word depending on which camp you're in around that. And so it's used as a kind of bludgeoning tool to divide. I find one thing really interesting. I've got a friend in the UK who's a very, very conservative Baptist minister in a working class community. And he would describe himself as a socialist. And he sees that as like this is just, my community's always been this. And he finds these sorts of discussions between Marxists and capitalists so bizarre, whereas like in the world I inhabit, it's inconceivable that a Christian could be a socialist kind of thing like that. And so you've got these big meta-narrative discussions going on all the time. And this labeling is feeding into that. People are using the labeling to try and identify where they are in this bigger thing, where there are people who have a lot in common theologically on paper. Their statement of faith is 95% the same. And yet you pay one nod in one direction and all of a sudden you're labeled with this entire group, and we forget about the 95% of theology that we have in common with each other. And so I find that quite strange in some ways that these terms are used in such almost violent ways, because they're really there. They're being used to divide. They're not being used for conversation and discussion.
Brilliantly put. And it's interesting that Africa, or most African countries, were liberated or gained their independence via the auspices of the likes of Russia, North Korea, and China. Ergo, the reality of communism and Marxism in Africa is actually a positive one in many Africans' consciousness. So there is this strange dynamic that comes into play when we use cultural Marxism without nuance or understanding of a historical trajectory. But there's a broader conversation on that front that we'll not engage in today. I see Pastor Jerome Gay has his mic unmuted, so I'll yield the mic to him.
Yeah, I just wanted to add. So, here in America, there's a huge issue with Black Lives Matter, the sentiment versus the organization. And so recently, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, the organization, said, "We are trained Marxists." So what's happening in America is, like, if you just use the hashtag Black Lives Matter, then you're lumped in to embrace everything the three founders of the organization would affirm. And there's no grace given for nuance. And I think there's definitely some duplicity of evangelicals who say, "Hey, I'm reformed," and some of the reformed theologians own slaves in history. And so they allow themselves nuance to say, "Hey, I embrace this, but I distance myself from this." But they're not allowing Christians to say, who believe that the Bible has something to say about justice. The Bible cares about how people are treated. The Bible cares about your spiritual well-being first and foremost, but it does care about your physical well-being. It cares about holistically your humanity. And so that's to answer the question. That's kind of where it's lumped in here is, again, I have to always say, hey, I agree with the sentiment. I don't agree with the organization, just because people are quick to label you without actually hearing your point, which is, again, another form of hypocrisy, because they'll argue about individuality and no asymmetrical view of blame and guilt, but then again, they don't afford people who want to fight for justice through a Christian lens that same grace and nuance.
Brilliantly articulated. I'm going to move on to two more questions. We have two more questions that we have enough time for before we get back into our normal prepared questions. So we have a comment coming from one of our SATS faculty, Mr. Jose de Carvalho. He asked, I find the subject often getting muddled up, that is critical race theory, creating greater divide, which we established earlier. For example, most evangelicals would support women's rights and equality with biblical parameters, but when the movement speaks with one voice with the LGBT society, it makes it difficult for evangelists to identify with the movement. So you ask, I hope my thoughts are clear. Anyone want to take a stab at this one? I see Reverend Light's microphone is unmuted, so I'll yield the mic to you. Over to you.
Actually, it was accidentally unmuted, so I think I'm going to give a miss on this one.
Okay, anyone else want to unmute intentionally?
Yeah, I'll jump in this one. I know it's a little fiery, but it's hard to talk about movements that speak with one voice. And maybe in the U.S., I'm saying that in my context, because it might appear that way, and our society is fragmented, and we have a left and a right. So we've all been saying the nuance issue is difficult, and for Christians, it's particularly difficult because we want to stand for Christ, we want to stand for the weak, but at the same time, we do have values that are formed and convictions. So I would say that it does get muddied, but with what Brother Murray has been saying, we borrow from all kinds of disciplines to help us. We borrow from science, we borrow from every field we can to help us think about the world, but we always run that through our framework of a biblical lens. So I'm hoping I can address that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for those comments. I see there's a long question from Tawanda, who is also a faculty member at SATS. And I'm not going to engage all of it because I think a lot of it has been covered already in this discussion earlier. So he argues basically from a position of premise, saying the premise of critical race theory is Marxism, and we have been discussing elements of nuance. He brings in feminist Christians into the dialogue there, and then the last question you asked, secondly, and building on the first question, critical race theory has been hijacked by both the left and the right. The left uses it as a bludgeon to silence any illegitimate arguments directed against them, and the right uses it as a means to demonize anyone on the left as crazy social justice warriors. Shouldn't we attempt to forge a different path, since this is already fraught with problems? Why do we not create a theory of dealing with these issues that is rooted in biblical principles and not sociological ones? So there is something to highlight here, in that we're trying to do that in this conversation. And a few people have come up with some nuances to critical race theory. There's an article that was written recently promoting what is called critical grace theory. And it's a very helpful article. It promotes nuance. I can give you the link afterwards. The other thing is there's also the reality that different people from both sides of the discussion would seek to champion their cause while muting the other. So there's also cancellation that happens in the conversation. So I do not want to get into that a lot in this discussion, but we can engage because I believe some of the elements have been covered already. So let's move on to the next prepared questions, and then we'll come back to the speed round after that, engaging what the audiences has put in the chat box. So the next question we have prepared is directed towards Dr. Edwards. How does critical race theory inform your work in the academy as a New Testament scholar? And how does this overlap with your identity as an African-American church leader in the current climate? Over to you.
Sure, thank you. I was reading some of the questions here from someone named Sean, I believe, and it relates a little bit to my answer here, in that we bring in, as a biblical scholar, we want to frame everything with a biblical lens. Yet I've been a pastor, so I can't help but to say, what is society looking at and thinking about? So sociology is not what we root our beliefs in, but sociology may inform us. And that's happened. I mean, we think about many movements throughout society that we don't want to make it seems like an ends justifies the means, but you've mentioned independence for countries in Africa. We've talked about some other things that ended up in let's say in a better place, but they're not always in the best place. So critical race theory helps me to think about power dynamics. I'm going to say one last thing about this, that theologically, sometimes, and some scholars have said, when Paul talks about sin, particularly say in the book of Romans, you could think of sin with an uppercase S, sin as a power, as an entity, a force to be reckoned with, and that humanity then becomes slaves to it. He says that in Romans 6. We can be slaves to something. So there's a system at work, this sinful dynamic, and we become slaves to it. So in a sense, we're not just individual automatons doing something. We are victims in some way of evil power. So in some ways, there's a parallel there to the way systems work. And I think theologically, we can then use that analysis of critical theory to say, you know what, there are some places where it affirms a biblical worldview, and those are the places where I can borrow from. So that's helped me. And as an African American, yeah, we deal with certain realities here in the States that make that analysis more cogent for me. Anyway, that's a lot. Sorry, but thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good to hear more about who you are and your journey to this point, and to know that you straddle the world of the church and the world of the academy, which is a unique place indeed. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Sorry, if you have anything else to share, please feel free. Okay, I hear no voice. Moving on to the next question. This is directed to Pastor Jerome. How has critical race theory affected your pastoral load and the discipleship emphases in your church?
Yeah, just to, as a pastor, my role is to lead, feed, know, care, protect, those kind of biblical pillars of my call. And I think one of the ways is just to have our people, we've said this repeatedly, think biblically about these issues. And so what I've had to do as it relates to critical race theory is something that I've taught our people as it relates to culture. And I say, I take a 3A approach. What can we adopt? What can we adapt? What needs to be abolished? And so I think a great example of this is Acts 17:28. Paul says, it's in him we live, move, and have our being, as some of your poets have said. So Luke records, he wrote Acts. And here it is, Paul quoting Epimenides, which would be, again, a pagan. This quote, in him we live, move, and have our being, was not directed towards Yahweh. And so what did he do? He adapted. He took he adapted that quote and then applied it to the true and living God. And so when it comes to issues of CRT, it's just reminding our people, okay, is there something about this that we can adopt? Perhaps we can adopt this idea of wanting to pursue justice. What do we need to adapt? Well, we need to adapt, again, what is the foundation of our identity? The foundation of our identity is our creator. What do we need to abolish? We need to abolish making a feature of who you are the foundation of who you are. And so when it comes to discipleship, it's just making sure we're teaching our people that, but then also let them know it's okay to co-opt terms. I think Dr. Dre was saying that earlier, is that, Paul literally does that in how he's engaging them at the Areopagus. He's literally taken a quote, a secular quote, if you will, not intended for the God of all creation. And then he's then showing us how you're applying this to this false God. I'm going to co-opt this term. I'm going to take that quote, and then I'm going to apply it to the true and living God. And so for us, it's just, again, reminding people that it's okay for us to engage these issues. It's okay for us to engage, but remember, Scripture is the foundation of how we engage these things. We want the Word of God to be preeminent and to have the precedent in our conclusions about these issues. So I'm definitely all for engaging, but not at the risk of, again, dismissing Scripture, which I know no one's not saying that, but I'm just saying in terms of our discipleship process, making sure I communicate that to our people.
Brilliantly put. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on to the next question now, and this one is directed to Pastor Oné Mokgatle and Reverend Stephen Murray. How has critical race theory affected your congregation's theological reflection and formation. To what extent does the theory help you address Africa-specific ills, if at all?
So how has it affected our congregations? Look, we don't particularly refer to the critical race theory, just by concept. It's not something that we talk a lot about, but it is, we do see it. We do see its impact and its influence in our congregation and how they speak or how they analyze or evaluate a particular issue. And so because of that, then it's important for us to understand what it is. So there's an educational component to it, where it comes from, what its purpose was, what has it done in the world, and then to put on our biblical lenses and ask the question, so how then are we to see it as Christians? I love what Pastor Jerome said in terms of the 3 A's that he uses. What are those things that we adopt? What do we abolish? And then the last one was, remind me again, brother.
Adapt.
And what do we adapt? And I thought that was brilliant. So similar here, we'll say, there's things that we want to rejoice over, there's things that need to be redeemed, and then there's things that we want to reject. So that's how I think it's just made us better students of the world, because it's forcing us to do that. We're not binary. We're multifaceted, if you will. And this takes me to Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10, where Paul writes that it's through the church that God wants to reveal his multifaceted wisdom. And so we have to recognize that as we dive into the multiple issues that we have here. And so how do we address it? Well, we step into that. We step into all those issues and we use whatever tools we have, whether there are theories that come outside of the church or there are tools that we find in scripture. But I think I keep coming back to the fact that the reality is the solution is the gospel, and everyone's affirming this. And that's showing our people that yes, you can have a tool, an instrument that helps you evaluate an issue, but make sure that as you're doing that with biblical lenses, you're constantly pointing yourself and others to the ultimate solution, which is the gospel. And so even when I think about critical race theory, it has a faulty view of power. That's what it does. It wants to remove power from a particular group with all those issues and dynamics, and says, if we put power on this particular group, then things will be better. It assumes that. Or it looks at power as an evil thing, that all power is evil. And again, when we look through scripture, well, no, it's how that power is used, how one conducts themselves with that power. And so the only way that you can get to that is if you put on your gospel lenses and realize that power compels me to serve, right? So I'm not saying that it's evil, but what do I do with it? Whereas critical race theory might go, well, if we just take power from this one group and hand it over to the next group, then everything will be okay. Well, it's like, no, it was helpful to analyze what the issue was, but that's an insufficient solution. And so if we're discipling our people to be able to do that, to recognize that we're not binary beings, that we're part of God's multifaceted kind of wisdom and expression, that's how he's displaying himself to the world, then we have to take on that approach as we assess the various issues in our particular context.
Brilliantly articulated. Thank you so much for that, Reverend Oné Mokgatle. We're going to move on to the next question now. Sorry, before we do, my apologies. Over to Reverend Stephen Murray. I almost forgot that this was a double barrel question. Over to you, please.
Well, Oné said everything already, so it's all good. But I think our congregation is similar to Oné, where we wouldn't have people running around with the label critical race theorist or anti-critical race theorist, but certain people in the congregation would use language and terminology and analysis tools that you can see they're gaining from kind of one side or the other. I think my biggest heart and challenge in terms of reflection and formation is to develop biblical justice, to be very deliberate and conscious in developing a scripture-rooted, gospel-centered biblical justice. I remember a few years ago, Dr. Micah Edmondson, who's in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, which is a denomination that we work quite closely with. in our church, and he was asked to give a presentation to the Gospel Coalition about what should Christians make of Black Lives Matter. This was prior to George Floyd, and one of the big pleas he made was he said that they're filling a gap where the church hasn't stepped up. Unlike in the civil rights era, where the civil rights era was led by the Black church in America, this contemporary secular movement is voicing a concern where the church hasn't been at the forefront voicing the concern first. And that really struck me and really moved me to want to go back and say, well, how do we then develop in South Africa, for example, a contextual biblical theology of justice? I mean, I'm a Presbyterian, so I love my confessions. I want to work on the Westminster Confession and say, how does the Westminster Confession and the catechisms help me to think rightly about justice? And there's so much in there once you start to look. And so that would be where I would want to put most of my effort. The critical race theory is there on the side. It's there to give me some analysis, for me to bounce it back and forth with my theological convictions and see, does it help? Does it hinder? But at the end of the day, the hard work is building something from the ground up, because I think there has been a gap, particularly in evangelicalism. I know you've got other traditions, like the Roman Catholic tradition has done a lot more work on social theory and things like that. I think we are a little bit lightweight in this area as a tradition, and we need to do more work. We need to do a lot more work.
Brilliant analysis. I see your hand, Vernon. I would like to continue with the questions, and then maybe we can come back. But let me afford you the opportunity to add a few comments. If you can keep this succinct, if you may, please. Over to you, Vernon Light, Reverend Vernon Light. Just keep it succinct. Thank you.
And I must say that without having heard yet of critical race theory, about 20 years ago, I had a long stretch working with Black South Africans, and I found that that listening to their stories was a real breakthrough for me. Now, I've subsequently discovered that the stories of the oppressed, that's a vital part of the methodology of critical race theory, is listening to the stories of the oppressed. And I listened for hours, perhaps hundreds of hours, and it was a wonderful learning experience for me. I really saw what insights I'd missed as a white South African. And by listening to the stories of my fellow Black South Africans, I came to realize the extent of what they'd been through, and how oppression had operated, especially in the apartheid years. So in that sense, I could say it's helped me. It's helped me focus in a way that perhaps I wouldn't have otherwise on some of the concerns in South African society, where you had the privileged and the underprivileged. And so just that, for me, there are aspects of CTR that have proved very helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that anecdotal approach, and that is very helpful to the conversation. I just noticed that we lost Dr. Edwards, so we'll hope to have him joining us shortly. And as we do, we're just going to move on to the next question, which is directed to you, Reverend Light. So the question is, does the theological concept of common grace hold any sway in the formulation and appropriation of critical race theory? If so, how and to what extent? If not, why? Over to you.
I would say that it's partly yes, the answer. For instance, the gospel positions converts on the same footing. We are all equal before God as sinners, and all receive the same salvation, and our ethnic and social differences should not prevent our unity in Christ. And I think these truths can be seen to some degree in the vision and agenda of CRT. But I think we can thus see common grace at work in CRT, but in the critical race theory, it does not ever really achieve a unity and equality between the oppressors and oppressed. It seems as though those two groups will forever divide humanity, and thus the theory does not fully reflect common grace.
Thanks for that contribution. Any other thoughts on this line before we move on to the next question? See, no mics are muted. Hopefully this is a discussion for later. So thank you so much for your perspective on that one, Reverend Light. The next question is actually a speed round. So we're going to breathe a little bit and we're going to hear about what skills you have developed or how endowed with superpowers you are if you are into the superhero mode. So since COVID-19 is now a pandemic affecting every single individual on the planet, I would like to know what new skill you picked up or you learned during your time in lockdown. Starting from my right to my left, I'll start with Reverend Vernon Light. What did you pick up during the pandemic? Did you pick up a new skill, and if so, which one?
Not really. So I have been much the same. I'm learning all the time, obviously through reading and work at the seminary, but not any specific new skill. Perhaps just to maybe get used to the lockdown. I find myself thinking now, I've got to choose now between having church in the comfort of my own home and going out, to the church venue to meet with other believers. So I'll have to just push myself out of the nest here, as it were.
No, thanks for your candor. I think the new skill you learned is actually being in lockdown, so we appreciate that. Over to Reverend Mary, over to you, Stephen. What new skill did you pick up during lockdown?
My new skill is my growing ability to preach to a camera, which is, I think, a skill many of us pastors have had to learn. I know how to use microphones better than I knew how to use them before. I know how to unmute myself on Zoom better than I knew how to do that before. So it's all that kind of technological stuff where I'm having to learn, and the learning curve is quite steep the more you try to do stuff in that area.
So if we throw in guitar skills into that, you'll be producing an album with the Killers in less than a year, eh? No, we'll keep that one nice. Moving on to Pastor Oné Mokgatle. Any new skills, brother?
Yeah, mine will probably be the same as Stephen Murray, in the sense of learning very quickly how lighting works, how sound matters, the room. Like that stuff I never cared about it before, and so in lockdown, learning how to preach a sermon in front of an iPhone. I think the first couple of Sundays when recording, it would probably take me a good 7 takes, and it wasn't the sermon, it was the lighting was really bad. I got to open a window, or I didn't realize that the microphone wasn't sitting where it was supposed to be sitting. So I've learned that, and I appreciate people who are in that space even more.
Brilliant. Moving on to Pastor Gay, over to you. Any new skills that you picked up during your time in lockdown?
Yeah, I just really tried to hit some fitness goals. So I got under an 8-minute mile. So that's for me, that's that was an accomplishment for me. I did it once. I'm trying to make it a regular thing.
I think you and Oné, if you haven't met, you should spend some time together, because I hear there is some similarities in the way you move. I'm not sure Oné is under the 8-minute mark, but I hear that by the grapevine, but there's some some muscular stuff going on in some regions. So over to you guys. Dr. Dre, as you affectionately known.
Yeah, I guess I appreciate that. I was learning to troubleshoot right here because I was having problems with Big Blue Button. But apart from that, I've been baking with yeast bread. I'm making yeast bread. That's something that's been kind of fun to learn how to bake better. And I wish I had some right here to show you because it's down in the kitchen. But so I've been perfecting some baking skills. Thanks.
Oh, brilliant. The man plays flute, the man plays woodwind, the man is a scholar, a church leader, and he bakes. Ladies and gentlemen, he's complete. Now, we would love to hear some of your bread, but sadly, the virtual reality offers us a rather steep, or should I say, a very solid barrier to partaking in your fantastic baking. So we're going to move on to the next section now, and this is basically hearing from our audience. We have a few questions that have been posted in the chat box, and we'll continue with those. So hearing from Sean Joint, Dr. Sean Joint, who, so let me just scroll back up if you allow me. He asked the question, I perceive that often persons are attacked instead of ideas being discussed. There is some truth to the cultural Marxist label, but we can't use it to shut down the conversation. It needs to be one of the doors we can use to dialogue. So that's a comment rather. He continues, hashtag Black Lives Matter. My daughter, who is studying political science at undergrad level, and I have had chats regarding this. I shared with her that I support the principle and idea behind it, but I cannot support the movement ideology that is a Marxist, queer, new age foundations to it. There have been drink libations poured out to the spirits of the movement. So he's pouring liquor proverbially for the ancestors of that movement, I hear. So there was no question there, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Dr. Joint. Moving on to Brian Halsby, he says, I think that the fact that many white South Africans are not willing to recognize our white privilege becomes an obstacle to building meaningful relationships with other cultural groups. Any thoughts on this, Stephen? Because I know you've done a lot of work in this area and you've spoken a lot and are doing a lot of work with Hope and Ispambano in this regard. Over to you.
Yes, I do think that observation is spot on in some ways. I think it does. I think a lot, particularly here in South Africa, a lot of white people refusing to acknowledge anything in the area of the notion of white privilege, I think does provide barriers in terms of conversation. I do think, and this is where critical race theory actually muddies the waters for me a little bit more, is because of these discussions about critical race theories, people aren't really sure what white privilege entails in terms of the whole package. Are we speaking about just as an observational tool to say, hey, I get some things just based on the color of my skin, regardless of what my educational background is, regardless of where I am on the economic spectrum, I get some things in this society in South Africa right now because of my white skin? Because that just, to me, that seems obvious. It seems to me there is no comeback against that. It is because you can see it and you can explain it. But what do we do with that now? Because that's the next part of the discussion. Does that impute guilt to me? Does it put a certain responsibility on me? And that's where the conversation, I think, needs to go biblically. We need to wrestle with those things and say, what does Scripture actually say about ideas of corporate guilt or corporate responsibility? I think is a better term in that regard. But because of the muddiness around critical race theory and white privilege equaling white guilt, people just shut down and don't want to have the conversation at all. And I think that's a shame, because I think we should have the conversation and we should try and be clear on what we're talking about, what we do and don't mean when we talk about white privilege, because I think we'll make a lot more progress that way.
Brilliant input. Thank you so much for that. There is a statement from Pastor Caswell Nzeno. He makes a very important remark. He says, I guess in an effort to deal with racism from a biblical perspective, we will note that it is more a sin issue than a race issue. So often the language regarding racism is not described from a sin grid, but rather it is described from a race grid. And so anyone want to comment on that? I see Pastor Jerome Gay has just unmuted his mic, so over to you.
Yeah, we've had to address the idea was it's not a skin issue, it's a sin issue, and obviously I would affirm that assertion. However, sin has names. We have 10 commandments that is naming specific sins, murder, stealing, adultery, right, within the 10 commandments. So racism is a sin. It is the sin of partiality. You're showing favor to someone based on the color of their skin. And so I just would add that in us saying, it's not a skin issue, it's a sin issue, that, we don't stop there, because the Bible does call out specific sins, and hating someone gives a biblical reason to even question if you're a believer. Because in First John says, you don't love God who you can see if you don't love who you can't see if you don't love your brother who you can see. And so it is important that we, in that, since we're talking about this biblical grid, that we call out specific sins. And then and if people who are claiming the Christian faith yet willfully hating people, then Scripture would say, no, you're not even in line with the gospel or Christian theology.
Excellently put. I see a hand from Dr. Dre. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you all for that. There was somebody, I want to weave in, somebody made a comment back, last name, I think is Vonbrink, and said that critical race theory sees the problem as oppression, and then activism, outcome, liberation, Bible, it's sin, redemption, restoration. And while I have some general agreement with that, I think I want to press a little bit more, because even though we call racism sin, I think what critical race theory has helped us to say, it's not about necessarily somebody hating somebody. And that's where I think we might struggle to find common ground, because there are plenty of white people who thought they loved the mammies who were taking care of the babies and did not see the structure that allowed them to have a privilege over someone else. So sometimes these discussions get reduced to personal interactions, personal hatred, and frankly, that might not be interplay. I mean, if the government has a system that allows some group to have dominance over the other, then we've got a sin problem in that structure, and it's not about one person maybe hating somebody else. And I think I raised my voice at 3:30 in the morning here, and I didn't want to break any of the rules of I got animated in my answer, but I'm sorry. I just wanted to make the point that structures can be evil, and it's not necessarily that somebody's hating somebody else or might not understand their interactions with somebody else.
You're welcome to raise your voice at that decibel, because I was saying preach internally. So there you go. Amen to you, brother. Thank you so much for that contribution, which has been very, very eye-opening. Not eye-opening, but rather clarifying on the nuance that was being covered there. Folk, we're going to move on to the next section where we have a few other questions set up, and we'll keep receiving questions from our audience. We will engage with the panelists as we keep going. So over to the next section, question 11. Does an over-reflection on critical race theory mask and perpetuate the prevalence of racism in all spheres of society? And this one is directed to Reverend Murray. Over to you.
Yes, in some ways, because I want us to keep critical race theory in its place as a secular social theory, in the same way we as Christians would keep any secular social theory in its place. Use the analytical tools, and it's helpful. But at the end of the day, we as Christians in the church are going back to what does Scripture say? How does Scripture guide us and building biblical justice and biblical racial justice out of that? And so I think that an overemphasis an over-reflection on it can distract from that overall goal, because we're so busy trying to parse the nuances of critical race theory and label people that we don't actually get on with the hard work of biblical justice. It's something that I just personally, from a personal confession point of view, felt that I've been guilty of this in the past. I've been getting into the academic debates, getting on social media, talking to people, having conversations like, well, what am I doing on the ground in terms of building a biblical justice and implementing it and helping people see it? And so I wanted to keep critical race theory very securely in its place as a social theory that provides analysis But my conviction as a Christian is that Scripture has the answers to these problems. We dig deep enough, we will find them. It has the solution, and we need to go there. So that would be my short answer to that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that response. We're going to move on to the next question, which is directed to Pastor Jerome Gay. How would you present the gospel to a congregant who views the world primarily through the lens of critical race theory? So preach the gospel to us and save us from the ills or the shortfalls of this, or pitfalls of this theory, if you may. Over to you.
No, thanks. I mean, obviously, the gospel is this message of redemption that, we are in sin. We are in need of salvation. It is Ephesians 2:8-9. It is by grace through faith. It is not something that we can earn. And again, not the broad stroke, CRT, but aspects of it is this idea of, you're trying to work something off, right? You're trying to, I guess, earn acceptance in a sense, not in the salvific sense, but in the culturally accepted sense. And so what I'm telling that person is something I said earlier, is like, when our identifying marker, not that we ignore, let me be clear, we don't ignore oppression. I'm not saying that we don't ignore oppression or those that are marginalized or, marginalization. We don't ignore those things. But again, when we're talking about the gospel, Jesus extends grace to the oppressed and the oppressor. That's the scandalous nature of the gospel, is that both have access to grace. And so if we only view it through the lens of oppressed or oppressor, then essentially we would be making the gospel limited and not limitless in terms of who the invitation is extended to. So I want to first unpack that and then go into just this beautiful reality that, yes, Jesus understands, and I believe he identifies with the oppressed. I mean, we can just read Exodus and we can see that. I mean, we see this idea of liberation there and God caring about the oppressed. But again, Paul was an oppressor who received grace. And so I think just given that full scope of the gospel is that, it's an open invitation, not universalism. Everyone's not automatically saved, but there's this open invitation to where God is drawing people to himself by grace and through faith. And so I think I want to come back again to this idea of, there's a need of salvation. Jesus becomes, Jesus is God in the flesh. John 1:14, he's skenao, the Greek word. He pitches a tent to come to live and to die and defeat death in our place. And the identifying marker for him was the fact that you would be eternally separated from him. It wasn't your race, it was your eternal status. And he did something to change that. So that's what I want to do and present, so that we don't muddy the gospel or limit the gospel by those other markers.
Thank you so much for that, primarily. That was an excellent exposition or succinct presentation of the gospel and how one could speak to somebody who is viewing the world through the lens of critical race theory primarily. Any other additions to this line of thinking from our panelists? I see Vernon's mic is unmuted. Please feel free.
I think CTR also tends to overlook various other serious sins. And so in dealing with a person who's seeing the world through the lens of CTR, I try and help them see that, there's a great range of sins that the Bible deals with, not just the sin, let's say, of oppression, and that these sins overlap both the groups, the oppressors and the oppressed. Thank you.
Brilliant. And I think you've made this point strongly, and we appreciate the fact that we are both victims and perpetrators. So the gospel tells us that we are victims of sin, but we are also doers of evil. So it puts us on an equal playing field regarding our actions and how we stand before God. And so to try and create privilege in our status before God as human beings is ungospel-like, and anything that does that stands in the face or stands against what the gospel proclaims. So that's another area that we can explore later. So thank you so much for that, Pastor Jerome. Let's move on to the next question, and this one is directed to Oné Mokgatle and Stephen Murray. How can the church in Southern Africa stand in solidarity with our North American brothers and sisters without sacrificing her responsibility to her immediate context? Over to you.
That's again a really good question, and I wish we had more time to unpack it. So I'm going to attempt to be brief. It's actually recognizing one another first and foremost, and it sounds very basic, but it's a real issue of recognizing the vast complexities that we face here in Southern Africa. I could talk about Africa as a whole, but the question speaks of Southern Africa, and just whether it's socioeconomic complexities or just the realities that exist there, and what that means, what access that gives you. So by being a church in a suburban context is very different to being a church in the rural urban context. And then also taking into consideration how we came about to that, like how did spatial segregation come to being, and how that has an impact on how we see one another. And so that's why I start by saying just recognizing one another. Vernon Light referred to the listening to one another's stories, and not just listening to them, but valuing them is very, very important. I think sometimes we make the mistake, I'm not saying that's what he did, but sometimes we make the mistake of just listening and then continuing with our days or our lives. But how do we listen and then value what they're saying and realize that it's shaped our context in some shape or form? So I would start there. But in terms of standing in solidarity with our North American brothers and sisters, is I think doing what we're currently doing at the moment is recognizing what's going on in there, and seeing how we might come alongside in just kind of I want to say activating, but that's the wrong word. Advocating, there we go, advocating for what goes on there, because of the influence of North America. I like to say it this way, that when the West sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. And we saw that recently with Black Lives Matter, with police brutality. We see how that kind of shapes the rest of the world. And so let's advocate for one another, but let's not take our eyes off, well, what does that look like here in our particular context? And I think sometimes we fall guilty of that, of easily advocating for what's going on there, and then kind of belittling value and life and meaning over here. But rather, how can we see what happens in North America and say, okay, wow, what does that mean for us? What are the injustices that occur here, and how do we advocate? How do we hold government accountable? What's the church's role in all of this? And we do that by listening and valuing what's going on around us, and not belittling it just because maybe it doesn't necessarily have a platform.
Brilliantly put. Thank you so much for that. Heading over to Stephen Murray, over to you.
For me, I think solidarity means getting on with the work here in South Africa in many respects. Because I'm not in America, I remember both when the stuff happened in Ferguson a few years ago, and then now again with George Floyd, was seeing all my African American colleagues who I'm in various networks with, church planting networks, lamenting and grieving and feeling this grief, because these are the guys I go to conferences with and I see, and they're just broken. They don't even want to write anything on social media. They don't have words anymore. And I lovely gospel brothers and sisters, and I'm going there and going, well, what do I do? And I go, well, I've got a mission field right here with similar stories, similar histories, similar trajectories. My act of solidarity is to get on with the work here. My act of solidarity is to say, well, why are Black bodies undervalued in the South African context right now, which they clearly are. Lockdown has demonstrated that to us. And what can we do as a church? And I think that's the best thing as South Africans we can offer in terms of solidarity. Obviously, there's support and prayer and friendship and partnership and discussions like this where we can share ideas, but the real work is getting off of social media and getting onto the ground and making a difference, I think.
Brilliantly put. Sorry, I moved my cursor too quickly there. Thank you so much for both your contributions, Oné and Stephen. Moving on to the next slide, which is directed to Vernon Light and Stephen Murray. So should the term critical race theory be used in the South African discourse on race?
I would say yes and no. Its methodology plays a role in helping Black and white South Africans see how apartheid and its legacy has polarized the two groups, and in particular privileged the whites. Then I also feel that the term CRT should be used carefully, can be used, but if it's not used carefully, it could again put the focus on the differences and thus undermine the progress that has been made against racialism. For many, they might say the progress has not been significant, but I think it's been there. So I think that the term has some relevance to the church in our context here.
Thank you so much, Reverend Light. And now over to Stephen Murray. Over to you.
In some ways, this is not our question to answer because it's going to get used anyway by the broader community. I'm ministering here under the shadow of the University of Cape Town, and it's the common parlance of the academy. It's on talk radio, it's on TV, so it's going to be used anyway. So I think what we should strive towards is understanding, making sure we're clear on our terms, what we mean, what we don't mean when we use the term, because the discourse is going to come in more and more anyway. And then having individuals like Donald Trump in the US saying, well, now we're going to make a policy against critical race theory being taught. I can't remember the ins and outs of what he said, but that puts it on the agenda straight away as well. So people are going to speak about it and use it, whether we decide they should or shouldn't use it. Our question is to be clear on what it is so we can teach clearly around it. And I think try and do all the stuff we've been speaking about, parse it well, apply the parts we're able to, speak out against the things we think where there is a disjunction with Scripture.
Well said. No, just want to highlight the importance of vocabulary, that the oppressed are not skilled in coming up with vocabulary. And so often the language of critical race theory, the language of Marxism and elsewhere is not something that comes out of comfort, but rather it is trying to articulate from a position of pain, regardless of where one stands regarding it. Ego, yeah, I see a hand there. Before I go into a soliloquy, I will hand over to Reverend Mokgatle. Over to you.
No, Dr. Bat, what you were saying was spot on, and I think it's one of this question, particularly in the context of the church, affirms that illustration that I used of when the West sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold, and so even being labeled a cultural Marxist, for many people here, they become that not even knowing what that even means, and it's a decision that was taken or a comment that was made somewhere else, but now it must become the overarching. If you use this phrase, then you are this. And again, it confuses the dialogue, the discourse. It becomes super unhelpful because someone is dictating how this conversation should go in a context where we go. It's not to say that sin does not happen here. It's just how you have clothed it makes no sense to us. It's a very short-term missionary approach that seeks to come, do whatever it wants to do, and this is in the negative, so I'm all for short-term mission trips, but in the negative, come, do whatever it wants to do, set up in a context that is not his own, and then pack up and leave, leaving the people of the context going, okay, so what do we do now? So I'm affirming what you're saying, and again, should it be used? Man, it's an interesting one. It's an interesting question to answer, and we have got to go. So, but where does it come from, and what does it mean over there? Okay, how does it then look over here instead of a copy-paste approach?
Thank you so much for that. Colleagues, I'm aware that time is about to run out, and I'm really grateful for our panelists who have stuck through the past hour and a bit, and have given us the best of their contribution to this conversation. I'm really particularly grateful to Dr. Dennis Edwards and also to Pastor Jerome Gay, who have really given us their best at early hours in the morning. So these men are champions, should I say. If I had a medal, you'll have a few. Notice what I said there. So I'm really grateful for your contribution to this conversation. We have a couple more slides to go through, and then we'll aim to finish at the top of the hour. So if we can continue with question 15, and this one's directed to you particularly, Dr. Edwards and Pastor Gay. Is it possible for the church in North America to stand in solidarity with our Southern African brothers and sisters without exporting North American culture wars to the continent?
I'll go ahead and take a stab at it. I sure hope so. I mean, I want solidarity. I want to connect well with you, and but I do think that the culture wars, I'm not sure we can miss. I think they're always going to be there. So I think we're always going to have to negotiate that, and I think that's what we're saying now. In that, oh my goodness, the language, the difficulties of separating the politics and all of that. I think it's there, but I sure hope that the Christians can lead the way in building a relationship and true solidarity. So I don't know. It's a hope. I want to say yes to this.
Yeah, I agree. It's a hope of mine as well. But I think, just to be blunt, when we talk about American culture, even when it comes to the Christian faith and his history, a big thing we're still fighting here is whitewashing. Christian history, and I just recently actually wrote a resource on this. Like, in my seminaries, all of the African church fathers are presented as white men. The African female martyrs, Perpetua and Felicity, are presented as white women. So, and the way that ties in the culture is there's this imperialistic view of white culture as the standard for every other culture, or there's not even an admission that white people have a culture. And as a result of that, what's happening is the white way is the right way. And so, as if they don't bring any cultural affinity to their hermeneutic or the way they approach it. And so, as a result of that, I'm hopeful, but it's like we're still fighting that here. And so it tends to just automatically be that culture war. So even here, just Christians here, the Marxist label, a lot of that is coming primarily, not all, but primarily from white evangelicals who have not even engaged other points of view, because it's just easier to label you liberal, Marxist, critical race theorist, than to actually hear your point, because it disagrees with some of their cultural views of the Christian faith. And so I'm hopeful, but it's like, and that's the reason I wrote my second book coming out called The Whitewashing of Christianity, a hidden past, a hurtful present, a hopeful future, to unpack these things, this historical whitewashing and how it affects how we see the Christian faith. And so as Dr. Dre, I'm hopeful, but it's like we need our white brothers and sisters to admit that, like, we can historically prove that you whitewash history and Christian. I mean, literally painted the Bible white, like Moses led a million white folk out of Egypt. Like that's how it's presented to us in imagery in our books. It's like everybody in the Bible was white except maybe Samson. We might get him with dreads, but other than that, we don't get anybody. And it's like, it's ridiculous. But it affects even evangelism, because Black and brown millennials have existential issues with that. Like, does God even like me? Because the way we present Christian history is he don't use anybody Black or brown. We make all these Middle Eastern people white. And so we're still dealing with that. Like we're still, I understand. I got my master's in 2016. Again, all of the imagery of the African church fathers at my seminary, again, they were white. So sorry, but yeah, I mean, I think we have to deal with that. And obviously, even as just even the imagery in Africa of Jesus being white, so it's just that we got to deal with that stuff. That's a cultural issue, and it's a revisionist biblical history that needs to be addressed.
Fantastically put. I couldn't agree with you more. I really would invite the audience to hear the impassioned appeal for us to correct our lenses of viewing what history is and how we communicate it and propagate it in different spaces, specifically within this area, because it has got effects that are lasting, as was communicated by Pastor Gay. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. Folk, this was question 15, so which means we need to move on to the next speed round before we come to the close for today's session. Again, I would like to appreciate you for the time you spent discussing this very important topic. But our speed round now is this. Where were you when you first heard that George Floyd had been murdered? I'll start from my left, or from my right rather, to my left, beginning with you, Reverend Light. Over to you.
I was sitting in my lounge listening to the news, and that's where I first heard about it.
Stephen Murray.
Yeah, I was at home because of lockdown. I think we were all at home, all the South Africans at least, where we were stuck in our houses, and most of us on social media. So I think I saw the video posted on social media at first. That was where I was.
Yeah, social media, same as Stephen Murray. On my phone, I think it was on Instagram.
Pastor Jerome.
Yeah, I was home doing sermon prep, interestingly enough, and then I heard about it.
And I was also home, but I will say my heart was in Minneapolis. I had been a pastor in Minneapolis till a couple of years ago, so I was feeling it, but I was at home when I was seeing it here in Chicago.
Thank you so much for sharing. One of the things I'd like to highlight is that often when we speak about critical race theory, we forget that there are people involved, and we dehumanize the concept for the sake of scoring ideological points. And what the gospel teaches us is that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son. So as we reflect on this topic, as we engage some of the questions in the chat box, may we come back to a place where people matter, as complex and as difficult as history is, where people are loved by the Christian community, and we demonstrate that both in speech and in deed. Next question in our speed round is this. How did your church respond to the murder of Jerofatso Bule? I'll start again from my right to your left. Over to you, Vernon.
To be quite honest, with the lockdown story, I didn't get any, the church didn't respond as far as I can remember. So that was my situation.
Thanks for your kind. Stephen.
We didn't have a direct response to that particular killing, although at the time of the George Floyd incident, what we did was I wrote a pastoral reflection on it and then tried to apply it to a South African context specifically, because there were other killings that happened during lockdown as well here, and then put out a series of resources for our congregation to kind of go through, and then left it because we didn't want to keep pushing the issue. I actually wanted people to read and immerse themselves in the resources about race, about history, and process it from there. So we actually haven't revisited in a formal teaching context since the actual George Floyd incident. Partly because when I want to talk to people, I want to actually say to them, have you read the stuff? Before I don't want to have conversations on the basis of social media or he said, she said. I want us to be doing biblical work on these issues.
Thanks so much. Oné?
Yeah, so just our church, in many ways, is always seeking to figure out how does the church become salt and light in the context that we're in. What does reconciliation look like? How does the church fight injustice? And so what we did is we lamented first and foremost. We had women, some of our more mature women in the faith, many of them elders' wives, write a piece that became somewhat a positional paper in our view of gender-based violence, particularly femicide. And it was a phenomenal article. And then we spent 2 weeks just listening to the stories of women in our church. So we had them write pieces of their experiences, and it was just really sobering. And we put that out on social media. We put it out on our database, so everyone who's part of our community got those. We didn't edit them, so they were raw, unfiltered, and just kind of forced us to sit and sit in it and realize, especially as men, that this is by our hands, and particularly Black men in this context. And so we, as men, got together. We started talking about, what are some of the ways that we participate in this unconsciously, and then what does the gospel compel us to do? So in a nutshell, that's what we did. All of it to say we lamented, we listened, and then we asked the question with biblical lenses: what is our role in seeing that this comes to an end? So that was our response.
Pastor Jerome, I'm aware that this is a South African specific matter, so I would excuse you if you have never heard of Jehofatso Bule, but do you have any thoughts to share?
Yeah, I didn't. I hadn't heard about it. I hadn't heard about it over here, but I, just reading about it, her being pregnant at the time. Once you sent us, I went and read, and it, it's just horrific. I think for us in the States, one of the things us as Black clergy males is just to reiterate just the challenges of Black women face and protecting them. And we see that it's not just an American issue. So I definitely was praying for the family after reading the article. But, we didn't have a response. I wasn't even aware of it, sadly, but definitely in solidarity and prayer for everyone involved.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Dre.
Yeah, we don't, we seem to center the United States so much that we don't really pay too much attention to what's happening in other parts of the world, unfortunately, or take the news very seriously. So I too had very limited awareness. I don't serve a church, but I expect churches I attend to address issues that are happening in society. So I didn't hear much about this at all. But my heart also is heavy as I've read pieces on media about this killing. So,
thank you so much, panel. We are grateful to God for you and for the gracious way in which you engage the subject matter. I'm grateful also for the many ministries represented here and your faithfulness in the ministry. It is a great honor to know you. Some of you I know very well, and some of you I'm getting to know. I'm looking forward to the journey ahead, not only for me, but for us as an institution, as SATS, that we would partner in the gospel, and that will co-labor to see the kingdom of God come on earth as it is in heaven. It is a joy, again, to have heard your stories and to hear your pain and to see your pain on the screen, especially to our African-American brothers in the group. The manner in which you carry yourselves is exemplary, but we pray that God would use that to affect change through the gospel. And so again, from myself, a hearty, great thanks to you for sacrificing your time and for sharing in this space.